In this podcast episode, historian Sir Antony Beevor explores the complex factors shaping the Russian mindset and the country's distinct path compared to Western Europe. The conversation covers Russia's history from the Mongol invasions to the modern era, focusing on themes such as the legacy of conquest, attitudes toward warfare and casualties, spirituality, leadership, and the socio-political consequences of these historical experiences. Beevor provides detailed insights into Russia's cultural contradictions, the impact of autocratic rule, and how historical trauma continues to influence contemporary Russian politics and society. Sir Antony Beevor emphasizes the profound impact of the 13th century Mongol invasions on the Russian psyche and method of warfare. He explains that these invasions introduced a doctrine of conspicuous cruelty, with the Mongols adopting extreme measures of fire, sword, and mass destruction as a natural part of warfare. This initial trauma embedded a deep sense of encirclement and paranoia within Russia, which he argues still influences Russian attitudes today. Unlike Western Europe, which underwent the Enlightenment and developed codified laws of warfare and humanitarian principles such as the Geneva Conventions, Russia's expansion east and south remained marked by savage conquest and a harsher approach to both enemies and its own population. This historical divergence is key to understanding Russia's different cultural and military attitudes. Beevor discusses the idea, famously expressed by Tsar Nicholas II, that Russia had to remain 200 years behind Western Europe to protect its traditions and culture. This enforced delay, he suggests, shaped Russia's development, making it more conservative and resistant to change. The vastness of the territory and challenges in governance made centralized control essential, often leading to authoritarianism and repression to maintain order. This time lag also meant that certain modernizing or liberal ideas filtered in late or unevenly, preserving a distinctive Russian character and approach to power. Beevor notes that this mindset, rooted in historical necessity and fear of chaos, helps explain why Russian leaders often behave according to older models of governance and expansionism. A striking element of Russian warfare that Beevor highlights is the perceived nonchalant attitude toward casualties, including those of Russian soldiers themselves. This is partly explained by Russia's massive population and the long-standing assumption that sheer numbers could overwhelm any enemy, the so-called Russian steamroller. However, this attitude also reflects a brutal tradition of treating Russian soldiers as expendable, sometimes as harshly as the enemy. Beevor recalls distressing examples from the 1990s of high suicide rates among conscripts, neglected veterans, and forced recruitment practices, including the use of prisoners and foreigners as frontline soldiers or even suicide bombers. Such callousness undermines morale and loyalty, contrasting sharply with the more humane practices seen in Western militaries, such as allowing prisoners of war contact with families. Beevor contends that the Soviet communist ideology exacerbated and romanticized ruthlessness as a form of heroism. Total domination of the enemy, crushing bones, and absolute loyalty to the state became almost sacred ideals. This mentality justified atrocities against enemies and civilians alike, and even extended down to Soviet soldiers being ordered to execute starving or bribed orphans during World War II. The dehumanization and extremity of violence were sanctioned as necessary for building a communist future. This legacy of brutal pragmatism in warfare continues to influence Russian military conduct and political culture. Russian history has repeatedly demonstrated a widespread cultural preference for strong, decisive leadership. This attitude has roots in traumatic periods, such as the Time of Troubles, following Ivan the Terrible's death, when the absence of firm authority led to civil war, chaos, and suffering. Such experiences impressed upon Russians the belief that only a powerful ruler can hold the vast country together and prevent descent into disorder. Beevor suggests this explains why Vladimir Putin, despite criticisms, enjoys popularity for projecting a strongman image after the perceived weakness and chaos under Boris Yeltsin's presidency. The longing for stability and order under authoritative control remains a dominant feature of Russian political culture. The Russian Civil War, after the 1917 revolution, was one of the most violent conflicts of the 20th century, with casualties perhaps exceeding those of World War I. Beevor describes how its brutality and scale had lasting ramifications for Russia and the wider world. The Civil War intensified ideological divisions between communism and capitalism, fueled fears of genocide and retaliation, and shaped global politics throughout the century. Its echo is still felt today, especially in Russia's internal attitude toward dissent, external threats, and the state's use of force. Beevor highlights what he calls a fundamental Russian contradiction, an intense spirituality and religiosity existing side by side with a tradition of cruelty and repression. This juxtaposition is not unique to Russia, but is especially pronounced due to the country's history and culture. Russian Orthodox Christianity, with its emphasis on icons, faith, and martyrdom, has profoundly influenced national identity and state legitimacy, exemplified by the power accorded to figures like Rasputin, whose spiritual influence over the royal family symbolized this blend of mysticism and political manipulation. Yet, this deep religiosity coexists with a willingness of rulers and the state to show callousness and repress dissent without remorse. The story of Rasputin is emblematic of the royal family's weaknesses and Russia's contradictions. Beevor notes that Rasputin's mysterious powers, especially his perceived ability to ease the suffering of the hemophiliac heir, Alexei, gave him enormous influence over the Tsarina and the monarchy. This relationship, however, damaged the credibility of the Romanov dynasty and fueled rumors and political instability. Rasputin's presence represented a breach of protocol and a symbol of the regime's detachment from reality and popular anger. Ultimately, this contributed to the collapse of the monarchy in 1917 amidst war, famine, and revolution. Beevor explains the origins of the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, as part of imperial rivalry in East Asia, sparked by Russian imperial expansion into Chinese territories and Japanese ambitions to dominate Manchuria and Korea. This conflict ended in a humiliating defeat for Russia, with the loss of the Baltic Fleet at Tsushima being especially devastating. The war increased domestic unrest, leading to the 1905 revolution and forcing Tsar Nicholas II to accept a constitution and a parliament, Duma, begrudgingly. The war exposed the weaknesses of the Romanov regime and set the stage for the revolutions to come. Beevor portrays Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra as profoundly ill-suited for leadership during Russia's most turbulent times. Nicholas's insecurity, emotional fragility, and detachment left him ill-prepared for ruling a vast empire undergoing rapid change and crisis. Alexandra's obsessive religiosity and reliance on mystics like Rasputin alienated the court and populace alike. Their inability to adapt, listen to counsel, or manage the political consequences of their decisions contributed decisively to the downfall of the monarchy. Their tragic story embodies Russia's broader historical struggles with autocracy and modernization. Looking at the present, Beevor warns of continuing bitterness and suffering resulting from the current war in Ukraine. He cautions that Russia's socio-economic challenges post-war, combined with the return of brutalized veterans, could create destabilizing consequences internally. He foresees ongoing resentment and vulnerability, especially in relation to China's growing influence over Russia's Far East. Russia's complex historical identity, marked by expansionism, autocracy, spiritual fervor, and a harsh military tradition, will continue to shape its international stance and domestic politics for years to come. In a broader note, Beevor urges greater awareness of the devastating environmental impact of war, which is often neglected in public discourse. With increasing global conflicts, resource wars, and climate crises, the consequences of violence extend far beyond immediate human suffering. He highlights the importance of addressing these broader challenges, including migration pressures, which have significant implications for global stability and require international cooperation.